Welcome to Sober Sunrise, a podcast bringing you AA speaker meetings with stories of experience, strength, and hope from around the world. We bring you several new speakers weekly, so be sure to subscribe. We hope to always remain an ad-free podcast, so if you'd like to help us remain self-supporting, please visit our website at sober-sunrise.com. Whether you join us in the morning or at night, there's nothing better than a sober sunrise. We hope that you enjoy today's speaker.
I'm David Thatch, and I'm an alcoholic. And I've been sober since March 9th, 1992, and I'm a member of the Primary Purpose Group up in Spartanburg. One of the greatest group of alcoholics I've ever spent time with in AA, and I hope, at the end of this, I'll get to tell you a little bit about them. I try to do that anytime I can. Before I get started, I want to tell you one thing. Dang, this is scary. I forgot my whole story sitting over there while they were reading. I'm told I'm supposed to tell you in a general way what I was like, what happened, and what I'm like now. So that means I'm not going to do a fifth step. That means I'm going to try to, keep it general and try to get to what it's like now, because that's important. I'm told I'm supposed to do that in order to tell you how I came to find a relationship with a higher power that allows me to stay sober today. And I'm going to do my best. I'm getting better at that. In the beginning, it was difficult. I came to this thing as an atheist and did not want to find a higher power, and was finally left with no choice but find a higher power. So, it's kind of hard for me to tell you how that happened sometime. So I'll get on with my story and see if we can figure that out. I was born in Pascagoula, Mississippi, and shortly thereafter my family moved to South Carolina by the time I was about 3. So I've been in South Carolina basically my whole life, except in and out with school, and in Spartanburg most of that time. Growing up around my house, about 5, maybe 10 years ago, I'd have told you I was brought up in this abusive home and all these awful things that happen. But I've listened to a lot of fifth steps since I've been in this program, and I've learned that a lot of people had it really bad, and I was very fortunate. I was very fortunate to grow up as I did. But there was a lot of yelling and screaming and, being told I was lazy or I was stupid or things like that. Things that left me basically feeling like I was lazy and stupid and didn't really measure up anywhere I was. And that's the thing I remember most about childhood was being uncomfortable wherever I was. Feeling like I was in the wrong place at the wrong time, being embarrassed. Basically walking into a room feeling like I had a booger on my nose and my fly down, I feel like that right now, But, that's how it was for me. So, by the time I found alcohol, I was ready for a solution. Prior to finding alcohol, though, I'd found a solution. What I'd done was something I found to be the solution today. I'd gotten real involved with my church, real involved with God, and real involved with Boy Scouts. And what it was about that was so helpful to me was the service projects that we did for underprivileged kids and things like that. And what I found that when I help you, it makes me feel better about me feel closer to God and closer to you. And I found that to be my solution today, too. But what happened with all that is I was a shy, little embarrassed kid, and at some point, some little project I did for the children's unit at the hospital downtown got attention. And it was announced in my school, and it wasn't cool. I was really embarrassed, and I just dropped all that, I dropped the service things, I dropped God, I dropped the whole thing. And shortly after that, found alcohol. To be honest with you, I got to tell you my story as it is. First thing I found was marijuana. First thing I got into was drugs. They were illegal, so they were a lot easier for a little kid to get than alcohol. And so that's what I got into first. And all throughout my story, drugs are there. I'm not going to talk to you all about it for a couple of reasons. One, this is Alcoholics Anonymous, and I understand and respect our singleness purpose. And number 2, I'm not an addict. I walked in and had a lot of people try to convince me otherwise. But what I found in looking back at my story, that I quit all that by a simple decision to stop doing it and not hang around with the same people. That didn't ever work with alcohol. A simple decision to quit was not enough. Or I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't be here tonight. So that's about enough of that. Shortly after that, though, I found alcohol. We got to pursuing alcohol. It wasn't something I found by accident. We heard it worked, and we sought out somebody to get something for us, and it was a friend's sister. And we were going to a little middle school dance, and we were little kids, 12, 13. And she bought what she thought little kids could drink, so I had my first drunk on malt duck. Awful stuff, you know. It was awful stuff. Y'all laugh, so you must know what it is. I don't have to explain that. There's some places, you know, they just look, and so I have to explain what it is. But, you know, and what happened that night is what I read later in the doctor's opinion. This is the first part of what makes me an alcoholic, is when I drank enough to feel it, I got a craving for more of the same. You know, that happened from day one with me. I didn't drink my way into alcoholism. From the first drink, I got a craving for more. And I drank all I had. The kids with me drank what they could. You know, they also aren't in an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting tonight. But they drank what they could. I drank all I had. They got drunk and got in a lot of trouble. What happened with me when I got drunk was I got comfortable. You know, and it was about the first time in my life where I felt okay. And we were at a little dance, and I'm a shy kid, scared of girls, scared of everything, and I was immediately comfortable and okay. And I pursued that with a vengeance after that. You know, I'd have been foolish not to, anything that worked that quick. You know, and so I pursued alcohol from then on. You know, early on, I wasn't drinking every day or anything like that. I'm still a small kid, and it's hard to get. But by the time I got to high school, I was a pretty regular drunk. You know, not every day, not all day, but at least 4 times a week. And what I did was set things up to where, you know, I had a job with alcoholics so we could drink. And I had ways of getting out of the house. I was an artist learning to paint, working with an artist who was an alcoholic. We could drink there. You know, I set things up a lot around drinking. And also, I got away with it pretty easily because I was an honor student. You know, I was one of the kids that they expected to succeed. And whenever anything in my behavior was questionable, you know, they kind of excused it for me because I was one of the kids they thought would do well. So I didn't get in a lot of trouble through high school. I mean, I was one of the first people kicked out of the South Carolina Governor's School for the Arts, you know, based on alcoholism. But then what happened, because I was one of those good kids, they also came back and reinstated me, you know, as I always kind of got away with things early on. Not for real long, but at that time. I think where my drinking changed for me is when I went to college. You know, I got down there and I didn't have anybody to answer to. Got away from the family, you know, that kind of thing. Things were bad at home, so that was good to get away from that, and I didn't have anybody to answer to, and I could drink when I wanted to, and so I got to doing the daily drinking. Same thing happened down there, was I got a lot of excuses for my drinking. I was a scholarship student. I was one of those they expect to do well. I was an art student at the University of Georgia, and art students were supposed to be kind of goofy, you know, and I was really goofy, you know, but, you know, I could get away with drinking. That was all part of the thing. I could drink in class. I could, you know, whatever. You know, I could get away with it. And really didn't have a lot of people question that for a while. I went on like that for a little while. I think my drinking probably changed by the time I was about 19. What happened when I was 19 is I started getting what we get, you know, waking up in the morning with the shakes, sweating, you know, vibrating. And I found that if I took a drink in the morning, then things would be okay. That'd settle down. And what happens when I take a drink in the mornings, I get a craving for more of the same, and I find myself drinking most of the day. And it started like that, you know, and I was a daily drunk, and I wasn't drinking 24 hours out of the day, but I'd get up in the morning, you know, get enough in me to be okay, get on to class, at lunch, go drink enough to be okay, and then in the evening drink till I fell asleep, and just did like that daily. And, you know, my drinking career is not that long, or it's not that long before I got to needing to quit. And by the time I was 20 years old, that was taking its toll. And this kid they expected to succeed couldn't show up to class, you know. And I was having a lot of trouble. And I had my first contact with Alcoholics Anonymous by the time I was about 20 years old. I hadn't been, you know, getting to class. I'd been having a lot of trouble, staying sick. And one of the best friends I had in the world, she came to me and said, "David, you know, I don't know what to do, and I don't know how to help, and maybe these people can." And she gave me a little card where she had written Alcoholics Anonymous and put the phone number of their answering service down on it. And I looked at that, and I drank on that a little while, and I contemplated that, you know, and I don't know how long it was. It may have been a day, it may have been 2, 3, and I called, and God bless this guy that answered the phone. I know he was doing everything he knew how to do to the best of his ability. But we got talking, and I said, "What do they do at those meetings, you know?" And he said, "Well, we drink coffee and talk." I said, well, okay, that's all right. And we talked a little more, and he said, we really don't have anyone as young as you in our group. And I thought about that, and I said, well, that's right. Alcoholics are usually pretty old, like at least 30, and I thanked him, and I hung up the phone, and that was my last contact with Alcoholics Anonymous for a little while. I managed to get through school, doing okay. Grades were good and all that. Behavior was awful, and went on to graduate school, and the game changed up there for me. Down in Athens, Georgia, it was all right to be a goofy art student, to be drunk, I could get away with a lot down there. I got up to Eastern North Carolina, and that was a conservative bunch of folks. And, I'm a graduate assistant, and I'm moving a refrigerator to keep my beer into the studio, and they didn't look too kindly on that, They started questioning what they had there. And what happened up there in Eastern North Carolina for me was, the reason alcohol became so important before then was it allowed me to do things I couldn't do. It allowed me to talk in front of other people. Stuff like this scared me to death. Always been scared of talking in front of people. It let me just do the things I needed to do. Well, I got up to East Carolina up there, and the thing that had always been my solution became the problem, and kept me from being able to do what I needed to do, and kept me from fulfilling obligations. And they were paying me to be there, and I couldn't do it. And I did the best I knew how for a while, and then I had to start looking for a solution. And I found a solution. As I decided I'd quit school with good grades and come back to Spartanburg and marry this girl I'd been dating. That would solve it. I got married, everything would be all right. Everything wasn't all right. Not at all. Because, I brought that drinking and behavior back. And I wasn't, I was barely working. I was selling some artwork and doing that kind of thing. And she was working all the time to help support this cause. And what happened within, 3-4 months of that is alcohol turned on me in a way that I didn't expect. Was I became everything I ever hated. I became a violent, angry drunk just about every time I drank. Not every time, but nearly. Violent, angry, verbally abusive to this girl, and who all she wanted to do was love me and marry me, And what happened to begin to change things for me was during this time. And sometimes, we do a lot of arguing, I do a lot of hollering and screaming, but at some point during this thing, I hit her, and it might be a lot of people sitting around here, that's not the worst thing they could think of doing, but for me, that's the worst thing I could think of doing, was hitting this little 95-pound, 5-foot-tall girl who I said I loved. And, I woke up the next morning, and what it was in the past, I'd do a lot of stuff while drinking, and excuse it away by saying, well, I was drunk, it won't happen again, or make something up. There wasn't any excuse for this. I couldn't say, well, I was drinking, it'd be all right. It wasn't all right. And there wasn't really any way for me to look in the mirror without wanting to vomit. And so I had to do something about my drinking, and I was making some promises to do some things. I went and sat outside an AA meeting and watched y'all come in and go, and couldn't go in, but I did start a career of trying to not drink. I didn't find AA real easy. I didn't say, well, I need to stop drinking, let's go to Alcoholics Anonymous. I began first, I went to my doctor, and I talked to him about what had been going on. I think I was a little bit honest with him, and told him what my drinking was like, and told him I needed to quit, and he agreed. He heard that and said, well, yeah, I think you do, and let me write you a prescription to help you not drink. And he wrote me a prescription for Xanax, keep me calm while I'm not drinking. That's right, and I wasn't honest enough to tell him I'd been taking that anyway. And so I take that home, and I'm trying to not drink, taking my Xanax, and it did what it always did, was created a craving for drink, just like drinking did with me. And so it wasn't long till I was drinking again, and I got just as violent and angry and nasty again and had to stop. And I went back to this doctor and said, don't you have something that would make me sick if I drank? I really need to stop drinking. He agreed I need to stop drinking. And he said, yeah, we do have something. It's called antabuse, and I want you to read this. And he threw some stuff at me that, bottom line, when you read it, says, if you take a drink on this, it's going to make you really sick and you might die. And I read that, and I was like, well, I don't want to drink, and dying might be good. So, yeah, give me that. And so I started taking my antabuse and drinking coffee and trying to do what I know y'all supposed to do when you're not drinking. And what happened, I don't know how long it was into that, 2 weeks, a month, something like that. What happened to me is what the book tells me my real problem is. Book tells me about the squiggly writing in chapter 3, where I start thinking. And what happened was, I'm taking my antabuse because I don't want to drink, and it might, and I really believe it might kill me if I drink on it. And I start thinking, well, now I wonder how much you'd have to drink on that before it killed you. And so I proceed like a period of really social drinking, my only period of social drinking, of sipping on a beer until I turn beet red and start sweating and feel like somebody stabbed me in the head and start breathing real heavy and ease back off a little bit. And when that get a little better, sip on that beer again until felt like somebody stabbed me here. And I don't mean guzzling beer, I mean sipping at it until you feel it, and I ain't social drinking, and I'm hanging around with friends. My friends weren't alcoholic. My friends were regular folks that, they may overdrink a time or two or go out and plan to overdrink, but they planned it, and they could go home when they wanted to. And I'm sitting around doing my antabuse drinking with these guys, and they're drinking what they want, and I'm beet red over on the end of the table going. After a while, that got embarrassing, and got real damn uncomfortable. And so, I start thinking again. And I start thinking, well, this antabuse is going to kill me if I continue to drink on it. So I quit taking antabuse. And that's what my problem is. That's my real problem, is that really not wanting to drink. Starting out in the morning, don't want to take a drink. I'm taking something hopefully make me sick if I take a drink. And by the end of the day, I'm trying to figure out how I can drink on it. And that seems okay. It says alcohol to the alcoholic, his life's the only normal one. That was it. Seemed normal to me. Well, what happened when I quit taking antabuse and just continued on drinking was that wife got bright and she quit taking any of that, when she left. And so I realized, well, she was the problem anyway. Because most of the trouble I've had around drinking involved her. And so I can probably drink. And wasn't real long after that, the law picked me up again, and they said, no, you can't drink, Or at least, son, you're not driving on the streets when you do. And so I, needed a solution again. It was time to stop drinking, I'm in trouble again. And I'm back living with mom and dad, trying to drink in the basement and all that, living down there like a troll. And so I'm trying not to drink. And so I get the idea I'm going to go to a counselor. That's going to help me. And so what I do is I'm real nervous talking to folks, especially if they want to talk about me, or they want, I'm not comfortable. So I drink about a 6-pack and I'd go talk to the counselor about not drinking. And I did this twice a week, week after week for I don't know how long, drink a 6-pack and go talk to this guy about not drinking because I don't want to drink. And I'm paying him to help me not drink and drinking on the way to go talk to him about not drinking. And that made sense. It made sense to me, maybe not him, but it made sense. And I think what was going on during that time was what happened with me later in Alcoholics Anonymous was I thought he was going to say something magic. He was going to give me some answer that all of a sudden I'm not going to want to drink again. And I'm going to drink my way on till, he gives me that thing. But I was thinking, what, a little self-knowledge might fix it. If I knew enough about me or this thing or something, I wouldn't drink anymore. But what happened, I guess, was my 6 turned into some more, and I forgot to go, and so I left that off. And I don't know, I was willing to go to any lengths, though, so I looked up a minister, and that didn't work any better, going drinking, talking to him. I didn't stop drinking. And I don't know, it just... it got strange, and things were getting really bad at home. I told you I was living in the basement like a troll and with my family, and, things got worse around my house than I ever thought they could. When I started drinking, it was bad growing up, but when I started drinking, I started reacting and shooting my mouth off, and that made it worse. And what happened down there was, on my 25th birthday, we celebrated by me and my dad beating each other up in the driveway, as that's how it was. And, that was another one of those things I just couldn't believe, had happened, that it was like that. And I wanted another solution, and I thought I found one, as I need another woman, and this one was a bartender. I figured, well, she'd understand, she's been serving me all this stuff. She's not going to suddenly tell me, well, you drink too much, she's been giving me this stuff. She didn't understand. What happened was, she was just as angry and just as violent as I was without drinking. And that didn't make for a good combination at all. And what would happen, though, was in the end, was while we were out there screaming and yelling, knocking each other down, cussing, throwing things, her little 12-year-old girl was laying back in the back listening to all that. And just like back when I hit that wife, I couldn't get up the next morning and feel like that was all right. That little girl had to lay there and worry and listen and hear that kind of thing night after night. And I really needed to quit drinking, I've been fighting with my dad. I've been fighting with the girl. Nothing's okay in my life. Nothing's all right. And I needed a solution. And I'd used up the doctors and the counselors and the minister and what I knew, reading books about not drinking and any kind of thing I could think of. I tried the exercise program. That's going to quit. I tried everything. And I was out of solutions. And, I told you I was going to try and tell you how I came to a belief in God in this thing. And it wasn't real easy. And I think I've come to a belief in a higher power by looking back. Looking back at my life and seeing that He was there when I wasn't paying any attention. And mostly the people I needed were at the place I needed when I was ready. Each time. And what happened was I was getting ready. And back when I was doing this antabuse drinking, I'd met a guy I was working with, and he introduced himself to me and let me know he was a sober member of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I was working with this guy. He never told me I needed to go. He knew I was doing the antabuse thing, and he was just laughing. He loved that. But I guess I would now, but, it seemed, he just loved that. But he never, he said, I find this works for me. And, he never told me I had to go. But what happened was, leaving that job and some of this stuff I was talking about going on, I lost track of him. I didn't know where he was. I think he had moved and I'd moved, and we wouldn't have known how to find each other if we had to. And I was going one morning down to get the paper, and he just happened to drive by. And he stopped. And I could have missed this guy by 10 seconds, either way. And he was just right there. And I didn't walk up to him and say, I'm ready to quit drinking, Wasn't like that. It just put him where he needed to be. I got him a job where I worked, and just put him where he needed to be. And then, a lot of this stuff happened, and I got ready, and I just said, hey, what do y'all do at those meetings? That's my question when I'm going to go to AA is, what do y'all do at those meetings? And he gave me an answer that wasn't profound. It wasn't your big book. It wasn't big 12-step work. Well, it was for me, but wasn't anything special. He just said, David, why do you go to bars? And I said, well, to be around people I have something in common with, just so I don't have to be by myself and people to talk to. And he said, David, that's all we do in AA. We just don't drink while we're doing it. Nothing profound, and I agreed to go. And he came down the next day and picked me up and took me to one of those meetings, my first AA meeting. And I couldn't tell you, I'd like to tell you I walked into that thing and, I heard the message and got struck sober and all that. And I don't remember what went on. I know my head hurt. I was sweating, I stunk, and I was shaking. And it was bright, and I think the building was yellow at that time. Made it even worse, it was yellow and bright. And I picked up one of those chips when they offered them at the end. And I think it was only because Ron leaned over and went, And but what happened was, the next day I wanted to go again. I guess I'd sensed there was some sort of answer there. I didn't know what was going on there, but I think I sensed that was my only choice, and I wanted to go again. Like to tell you, that was it. And I got sober. It wasn't like that for me, another number of years before I got sober. And truth was, I walked into a group full of crazy people. I walked into a group run by crazy people and newcomers. And all the crazy people came up and offered me help, And I met pathological liars that would come up and offer me a job when I needed work, when they weren't working themselves, couldn't find one if they needed it. Another one that moved himself into my house and ate everything I had in the fridge. Brought his dog with him to sleep on me. And another guy who, I was trying to stay sober. I couldn't make it more than a day or two, but I called him and he said, well, I'm down at this address, come meet me. And I go down there, it's a little bar. And I go in there to see him. I don't know, I guess that's, all right, some of y'all must hang out there, I don't know. And I went in and he's drinking and tell me he's picking up a 90-day chip tomorrow. I know that's not right. I know they mean in a row, 90 days in a row. And I don't want to drink, I'm not drinking because I want to drink. I don't want to drink. And I know that's not right, And what happened during this summer of Alcoholics Anonymous was that girl that I'd been fighting with who really wanted me to go to AA decided she didn't want me to go to AA anymore. She'd been meeting some of them, and she didn't want me to have what they had because they kept threatening to give me what they got. And so she gave me permission to stop going to AA, and I stopped. And I went on drinking for about another 6, maybe 9 months. Drinking was different this time. It wasn't the kind of drinking you do because you want to drink. It's the kind of drinking you do when you got to drink. You can't stop. And it just grew worse and worse, faster and faster than I thought it could. And what happened? At some point I experienced something I'd never experienced before in alcoholism. I'd been through morning jitters and shakes and vomiting and arrests and violence and all that, but I experienced something I hadn't experienced, which was DTs. As I found out if I quit drinking too quickly, stuff happened, stuff happened. And I spent a night just shaking and jerking and crawling around on the floor hearing sirens and ambulances trying to get to a phone. And if I could have dialed, I'd have done it, and got somebody over there to pick me up and take me somewhere. And got up. I don't know how long that went on. I have no idea. And but got up sometime the next day or so and realized, I need to call AA again. And part of having the right people where I need them at the right time, was this thing too. Was I called a man. My first meeting I went to, the guy introduced me to another man in the program, and this guy gave me a business card, and I put it in my wallet, and I kept it that whole time. I knew where it was. And I called the number on that card, and Joe was there. And Joe was still sober in Alcoholics Anonymous. And I didn't realize at that time what a miracle that was for me. Because I didn't realize the turnover rate we got in Alcoholics Anonymous. See, Joe wasn't sober but 90 days when he gave me that business card. And so when I call him up, he's just shy of a year. But, I didn't realize how few people sitting in these meetings all across the country tonight aren't going to be here next year when we are, And so it was an absolute miracle he was there. And I asked him, can I come back? I didn't know if y'all let people come back when they quit, And he said, yeah, and I'll meet you there. And he became my first sponsor. And I'd like to say that I came into AA and I got sober, and here we are tonight. It wasn't like that for me. It was at least a year and a half before I stopped drinking, And I'd try, I'd made some efforts at some steps, I'd try and do the steps. I'd try and do things they told me. And I'd make it like 3 days and I'd drink. And then I'd make it a week and then I'd drink. And I'd make it another 2 days and I'd drink. And I keep picking up those white chips, and then I'd make it 30 days and all of a sudden get smart and know how to stay sober and just start sharing. And get drunk on the way home, And, it's just like that for me, I picked up white chips till they stopped clapping. They just go, And then, and then I realized, well, this is a day at a time thing, and I don't need to be picking up those chips because they're obviously the problem. Thinking about that chip, and take drunk again, It just happened like that for me, I just take drunk. That was what it was like for me. And I think what the problem was is I didn't know what the problem was. The meetings I was sitting in, they were telling me to choose not to drink today, and I didn't realize I couldn't. They were telling me make a decision not to drink today, and I didn't realize that didn't matter. Didn't have anything to do with whether or not I drank that afternoon. I was hearing, remember you last drunk, and I didn't know what the book tells me. Is there's a time and place where that ain't going to happen. That's a good tool when it works, but if I rely on it for sobriety, I'm going to find myself struck drunk again. because the time and place is going to come where I'm going to forget how bad it was. I'm going to forget about hitting that wife. I'm going to forget about fighting in front of that little girl. I'm going to forget all that and take a drink again. You know, I was here and play the tape all the way through. When I'm ready to drink, there's no tape in the machine, you know. It just, very often, I find myself drunk without even planning to take a drink an hour before that. I didn't realize that no willpower-based solution was going to be a solution for me. You know, I didn't know it wasn't going to happen. So I just kept picking up those chips, you know, and I'd even, one grandstand move, you know, got an AA girlfriend. She was staying sober, you know, and maybe that'd work. She was staying sober, I wouldn't, you know. Tried everything I knew. Tried talking, tried not talking, just went on with it. And what happened, I went through this for about a year and a half. You know, occasionally I'd get to 90 days, a couple times, and be so smart they'd let me chair the meeting and take drunk on the way home again. And what happened was at some point I just got miserable. You know, as I'd at this point, made some really good friends in Alcoholics Anonymous, you know, some people that cared about me and I cared about them. They were staying sober and I wasn't. I'd cut out the drinking buddies, you know, I mean, all I had was me and y'all were doing okay and I wasn't, and that's a lonely place to be. You know, it's a really lonely place to be. And so somewhere around March 9th of 92, you know, I was supposed to chair a speaker meeting, chairing the Friday night speaker meeting at my home group, and I showed up drunk and chaired the meeting, you know. They let me chair it, you know. And, well, you know, my girlfriend had enough of me. And my friends, you know, they were giving up. You know, they didn't know what else to do. And I go back home, you know, just miserable, sitting on the couch like I'm the only person in the world. And my mother's going to come into town that next day, and I want to stay sober just long enough so that she thinks I'm all right. You know, I don't want her to know how it is with me, and all I need to do is stay sober that day. And I was drunk by 10 o'clock that morning, you know, and what happened was something in me broke. You know, something in me broke. It wasn't anything you guys could have given me. Is that thing in me that thought I could avoid taking the next drink was gone. You know, and I knew I was going to die drunk. I was positive that there was nothing that could be done. I was going to die drunk. And Mom showed up, and I just said, I need some help. You know, I need some help. I'd been resisting going somewhere. My sponsor had suggested a time or two it might be a good idea to take a little sobriety vacation. And I'd been resisting going anywhere because, you know, I had important things to tend to or work or something like that. Well, you know, at this point, nothing mattered. And I called my sponsor, Joe, and got him over, and he sat on the couch with me, and I said, Joe, I don't care if I lose my job and lose my house, and I don't care if I can't stick around and patch things up with Beth, because I don't care, you know, if I could just not drink. And I had to do so living under a bridge. That'd be all right with me. I just don't want to drink anymore. And he said, David, I've been waiting a year and a half to hear this. And so my mom packed me up in the car and took me on off to Alabama. Like to tell you, I went to a treatment center, you know. I mean, if I'd have had my way, you know, I'd have been in a nice treatment center where they fed you well and we talked about our issues, and I found somebody to blame for my drinking, and, you know, we all happy. But I found myself in a psych ward down in Alabama with people that had problems far greater than mine. You know, God gave me what I needed, not what I wanted. And what happened was God put before me people I needed to meet once again. And it was not long-time sober alcoholics 12-stepping me. It was people like, you know, I met a little girl with fetal alcohol syndrome, a little girl named Natalie. And she was about 15, you know, looks like she was about 7. And she was always going to live in places like that. And that was alcoholism, and that wasn't her fault, you know. I met another little girl that really got next to me. She had just come out of a body cast, being thrown down a flight of stairs by her alcoholic father. And she looked a lot like that daughter of that girl I mentioned earlier, and really got next to me. And I met a couple other women abused by alcoholic husbands that end up there, you know, and I saw exactly what I needed to see. I saw a lot of people abused by other people's drinking, abused by people doing what I was doing when I drank, and had no fault in it at all. And I paid attention. You know, it got to me. I began to understand a few things. And fortunately, before I got out of there, I met another guy. They brought him in on a wheelchair, and he got talking. He had all kind of AA slogans, you know. Sounded good in discussion meeting, I'm sure. But he was in there with me. And I got talking to him and found out he'd been sober 25 years in Alcoholics Anonymous. And, had moved down that way, decided he didn't like how they did it, so he quit going. And being older, his wife passed on, and he began drinking. And, they rolled him in a wheelchair. He wasn't even walking. He knew a lot of slogans, but he wasn't walking. And I came to understand a few things about Alcoholics Anonymous then, too. It wasn't what I know. It's going to be a lot about what I do. And I'm going to have to do this for a right long time, and I brought that home with me. And I came back just convinced I was going to die drunk. I didn't leave that place thinking I was okay. I left it knowing I was coming back to Spartanburg, die drunk sometime. And was just hoping, I could hang in long enough where my folks wouldn't have to see it, I just knew I wasn't going to stay sober, but I hadn't had a drink since that time. And I was wondering, for a long time I wondered, what was different this time? And, first thing, something in me broke, I know that. But, I don't know, I guess up until that point I thought there was something I could do about my drinking. And now that I realize I couldn't, finding a higher power became very necessary. And, what I did was, while I was drinking, I'd called people. I got my sponsor, a guy named Stitch and a guy named Hilton. Especially Stitch and Hilton. Those two guys, they were militantly sober, they scared me to death. And I'd call them all day long up until they had to go to bed, and then I'd drink all night, and then I'd start calling at 6 o'clock when they had to get up, and did that over and again. And these guys, not once did they tell me, call me when you're sober. They talked to me. And they knew I wasn't drinking because I wanted to be. They knew I was drinking because I had to, and I couldn't quit. And I got with these guys when I got back. In particular, Stitch hung around with him. And what we did is got over to his house, and he pulled this thing out. And strangely enough, if you read from the beginning and don't just go back to how it works, you find out what you got. And you find out there ain't nothing you can do about it. You find out what being powerless over alcohol really means. I've lost the power of choice and drink. I ain't coming back. And I'm going to have to find a higher power. And one thing he did for me, too, that was real important for me early on, was he shared with me a set of these Joe and Charlie tapes. And these guys were telling me the same thing. And they were telling me in a way I could understand what the problem was, what the solution was, and what the practical program of action was to bring about that solution. And I understood it. And that's just what I did. I didn't believe in God. I'd been, having people tell me, you've got to have faith. And I didn't have belief. Now, what was I going to do? And what I read in the book was all I needed was a simple willingness to believe in a power greater than myself to get started. And that's what I did. I started without a belief in anything but a willingness to believe in everything. And I got with a man, and we did third step just like it said. We got on our knees. And I chose this guy not because I, had any great idea about what God was, but I knew he had more faith than anybody in that room. And I heard him talk about it, and I saw him live based on that, and I wanted what he had. And I did that, did third step with no real belief, just a willingness. And I made a list of who I'd harmed, who I hated, my part in these things, my fears, the whole thing we know about the inventory, and I shared this with another man. To the best of my ability, it wasn't perfect, but told him, what I'd been doing in my life. And I got real willing to change. I didn't want to be that guy anymore. I really didn't. I didn't want to hang on to any of it. Now, unfortunately, some hangs on today, but I didn't want any of that. And I asked this higher power I wasn't too sure about at this point to, please help me not be like that anymore. And I made a point of trying to fix things where I could. Made a list of these people I'd harmed. I'd made that list back and forth. And made an effort, a real effort to fix what I could. And those things that I couldn't fix, and I did some harms where you don't go around them again because being around them harms them. I knew I would if I could. Some of the things I did, I guess to be specific, was I had to make amends to my family, And with my mother, she just wanted to know I was all right. All she wanted was to know on a regular basis that I was okay, because the biggest thing I did to her was create fear on a daily basis that her baby boy was going to die, And what I've done about that is every Sunday night at 6 o'clock I call my mother without fail. And if, I'm going to be out of town, I let her know and I call as soon as I can. She knows I'm here tonight. I involve her a little bit in what I do in AA because that makes her comfortable. and she's good with that. My dad was tougher. I did the basic amends, talked about what I'd done wrong and that kind of thing, and I left that not really feeling like that was sufficient. And so a little bit later, I think it was Father's Day rolled around, what I did was write him a letter. And in the past, I'd always focused on everything my dad did wrong. And what I did this time was write him a letter about everything he did do right, and how I was proud of him for coming off a farm in Mississippi and working to see that I had a life better than he had, and that I had opportunities that he didn't have, and I was proud of the man he was. And things began to change, little at a time, not immediately. I quit telling them how great I'm doing, and I just needed to show them that I was staying sober. And, proceeded on from there. I think one of the things early on in sobriety that became real important for me was this idea of service. You read about it in the book over and again. What I noticed was the people I saw that were most comfortable and happy in Alcoholics Anonymous seemed to be actively involved in giving back to the program. And I wanted to do that. And what I had in the beginning wasn't a whole lot to give. But I was in a clubhouse sort of thing, and what I could do was clean and mow the grass and take care of things like that, and that's what I did on and on. I asked them if I could paint the building, and I'm an obsessive guy. I ended up remodeling the whole place. It was about a year's worth of work, but, I stayed sober that whole year. When I was a guy that couldn't get by that Little Cricket and get my 12-pack and get by that liquor store right past it, I just couldn't get by those stores after work before I got home, and I found myself able to go straight to this building and work on something without taking a drink, and that seemed to help. I think, one of the things that was kind of funny was, kind of how I got into things like this, kind of service stuff I may do today, was early on that sponsor of mine, I'd go to a meeting and I was scared to death of you guys, I couldn't talk, and I'd go home and we'd talk about what y'all talked about, and he started saying, well, did you read anything at the meeting? And I said, well, no, they gave those things out before I got there. And he said, well, if you ask, I'm sure they give you one. And back and forth, for weeks I wouldn't read anything. And he'd keep asking me to. And then one night, I ran home and I said, Joe, I read the long one. Yeah, I'm a graduate student, scared to read how it works, But I was scared to death, I just knew I'd mess up. And usually what I did when I knew I was going to mess up is I didn't even try. And that began some things for me, funny little thing, but then you move on, chair some meetings, and after a little while, one of the older members came up to me and said, David, I'd like you to be treasurer for our group. And, I'm saying, Dave, man, I ain't no good with money. I'm no good with checkbooks. I can't do that. And he said, David, this is how you become good at it. And I'd made a decision that if Alcoholics Anonymous asked me to do anything, I'd do it. I'd just do it. And so I said, okay, and what I found out was I was pretty good at it. In doing it for you, I probably do it better than I do it for me. And I was pretty good at it. And then they ask you to do a few other things. By the time you get real good, then they take it away and give it to some other little knothead and who can't do it as good as you did it. And then they give you something else to do. And and that goes into GSR and DCM and things like that. And what I gained in service, is I found out things about me I didn't know about me. As I found out I'm far more capable. I'm far more competent and far more responsible than I'd ever given myself credit for. That I can do more things than I know I could do. And the only person holding me back from doing these things was me. And somewhere along the line, it got real important for me to do what I say I'm going to do, be where I say I'm going to be, when I say I'm going to be there, without fail. And it added integrity to my life, and that carried on into my business life and other areas and dealings with people, where I suddenly found myself able to look them in the eye and deal with them one-to-one, rather than, me right here and them up there, as it always had been, or not deal with them at all because I was afraid. Service taught me to do things like this. Scared to death, but, I know I can walk through fear with some faith and do the best I know how. And, if I mess up, y'all aren't going to kill me. And if y'all kill me, you ain't going to eat me. So, we're going to be all right. We're going to be okay. And I think one of the best things I ever got into was going down Spartanburg detox. I went down there at least twice a week, every week for years. And they'd let me come in on off times, not just meetings. I'd go sit back in the little smoking closet with the guys and just talk. And at some point it got real important to me to pay attention to their experience, because when I was having a meeting down at Detox and I was saying Serenity Prayer, I wasn't saying it alone. These guys knew Serenity Prayer. They've been in AA. It was obvious most of them were not first-timers. And I got real interested in their experience, what they'd found in Alcoholics Anonymous or not found. And I'd ask them, and a lot of them would say, well, I went to those meetings every day and I heard a lot of griping and moaning and complaining, and I just got kind of tired of that. Or, some of the women would say, I went to those meetings and, there weren't anything but a bunch of guys trying to chase me around. It's like being in a bar without alcohol. And things like that, and I paid attention. I think we too often write off people who don't make it just saying they just weren't ready. I don't know that. What was their experience? What did we show them when they got here? And it got real important to me to have a place where when somebody came in, whether it's somebody we met in the prison, somebody we met in the detox, somebody straight off the street from the answering service, that they come into a place where they're going to hear the problem, they're going to hear the solution, and they're going to hear the program of action to bring about that solution every time. And what we did was we decided to start another group, because the groups we were working with just weren't doing that. And it's worked out real well. What we chose to do is we just take our meetings out of the book. On Monday night, we have a literature-based discussion. And what we do is somebody will bring something out of one of the conference-approved books, a short passage, and that's what we talk about. We don't ask, does anybody have a problem? We assume if you're in AA, you've got a problem. And what you need is a solution. And that's what we talk about. And on Friday night, we have a big book study. And we read one page at a time from this book. And we talk about what's on that page, just about the black parts, not that stuff in between. Not what we think about it, but what our experience is with that page. And we usually cover about 2 pages a night, and it works out pretty well. What's happened in this thing is some of these guys have come in and found the value of sponsorship right quick and the value of working these steps. They came in, found out what they had, and knew they needed a solution, and decided the steps might be the thing to do. And you've seen a lot of them running around here this weekend, making coffee, cleaning up, and doing things like that. Is what happens, they do the steps quickly, and they get better quickly. And they're able to share that with other people. A lot of people got their opinions about this step work, but if I've been shot, I'm not going to wait till I feel better a year from now to go to the hospital. I'm going to do this work now and maybe recover from alcoholism. Not just get a little relief, but actually recover from this thing, be relieved of that obsession with alcohol so that I can get on with life. And that's what's been happening. We just got a good gang there. I guess I'm close to needing to wrap this thing up. And, I'm supposed to tell you what it's like now. And I guess I'll tell you a little bit. I've been talking a bit about my folks. I'll tell you what it's like there, Last time I was down with my parents, this dad I used to fight with, and we'd take swings at each other and all that. We spent a lot of time out on the boat fishing and just talking and being with each other. And he waits every Sunday night at 6 o'clock for me to call. And fights my mama for the phone, He just, we really look forward to talking to each other and really have come to respect each other, And my dad writes me little notes or tells me, I'm proud of you and I love you. And if you'd have told me that I would have thought that was important when I got here, I wouldn't have believed you. And I wouldn't give much for that today. I never knew how important that was to me. And my mom, I was down at their house, I guess it was around Christmas, and she just started crying because I was going back the next day, And she wasn't crying because what was going to happen to David, She was just going to miss her son. And she hugged me, and, she told me something I hadn't heard up until this last time. But she said, I know you're going to be okay. Y'all gave that to my mom, She knows I'm going to be okay. She knows where I'm at tonight and knows what I'm doing. And that's a big deal. But it took a lot of years of just trying for us to get there rather than me telling them anything. It's just consistency of doing what we do. I'd like to finish this thing up by telling y'all everything else is all wonderful in my world, but it's just not. What I found in here is that being a sober member of AA, being active in service and all that does not give us a pass from the normal problems that everybody has to experience in life. And, I've had some times in the last month or two where I've hurt worse than I've ever hurt in life, not just in sobriety. And I've had nights of crying and nights of just wondering what was going to happen next. And I've had the good fortune of learning a few things, from my sponsor, Bob. One of the last things he showed me was that by practicing what we do in Alcoholics Anonymous, we can meet any condition with some dignity, some courage, and some faith. And I watched Bob do that as he died of leukemia. And I know I can do that. What I've mostly been doing a whole lot of is prayer. And nothing elaborate. It's God, I don't know what's happening next. And please help. Please help me. And what happens is a friend of mine, George, will call and go, "Hey, how you doing?" And I'll go, "Well, I'm okay." And he'll say, "Well, I just want to check, bye." And he'll do that 2-3 times a week, And I know I'm not alone. And I know he does care. We don't have to talk 4 hours, And I know I'm not alone. And then a friend of mine, John Carnes, over here will call. And he'll say, "How you doing?" And I'll say, "Pretty good." And he'll say, "You don't sound like it. Why don't you come over here and we'll go to a meeting and go to lunch?" And I'll do that, and the day will be all right. And then I'll go down to the prison and carry a meeting down there and realize how very fortunate I am to be where I am today, no matter what's going on in my life. Is this a long way from that psych ward in Alabama to standing up here tonight? And I'm very fortunate and very blessed to be where I am today. And what I've come to find is all I need to do is trust that God's with me. He was with me when I was riding down to that psych ward in Alabama. He had a plan for me when I thought I was going to die drunk. He's got a plan for me today. I don't have to know what that is. All I got to do is trust He's there. Practice a few simple principles of this thing. And do my very best to share this with other people that don't know yet. And do that on a regular basis, and I'll be all right. I'd like to thank y'all for having me talk tonight.
Thank you for listening to Sober Sunrise. If you enjoyed today's episode, please give it a thumbs up as it will help share the message. Until next time, have a great day.